I said it without blinking, and I meant every word. But let me back up, because if I start there, you won't understand what that moment actually cost or what it was worth. My name is Walter Crane. I'm 63 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades building something quietly, the way my father taught me to build things with your hands, with your head, and without making a lot of noise about it. Dad used to say, Walter, the loudest man in the room is usually the one with the least to say. I never forgot that. It became the operating principle of my entire life. I was a widower when I met Diane. My first wife, Carol, passed from cancer 11 years ago. We'd had a good marriage, simple, honest, built on trust and a shared sense of humor that kept us laughing even in the hard years. After she was gone, I didn't look for anyone. I wasn't that kind of man. I focused on my work, on my son Gregory, who was finishing law school, and on the small but meaningful rituals that kept me sane: early morning coffee on the back porch, Saturday rounds at the golf course with my friend Russell, Sunday dinners I cooked for myself because cooking settled my mind. I met Diane at a charity auction in Charleston. She was there representing her company. She ran a boutique wealth management firm, Hargrove Capital, that she had built over 20 years from a two-person office into something that managed north of 300 million in client assets. She was 54 at the time, polished, sharp, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood its geometry, who had power, who wanted it, who was pretending. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and asked me what I did. I told her I was in logistics. That was not a lie. It just wasn't the whole picture. She nodded pleasantly and moved the conversation along. I remember thinking that she had immediately filed me in a mental category: retired, comfortable, not particularly relevant, and had decided to be gracious about it. That was fine with me. I've never needed anyone to be impressed by me. Carol used to say that was one of the things she loved most about me, and also one of the things that drove her absolutely crazy. Diane and I ran into each other again 3 weeks later at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends, the Aldersons. We ended up seated next to each other and talked for almost 3 hours. She was genuinely interesting, opinionated, well-read, funny, in a dry, unexpected way. I drove her to her car afterward, and she gave me her card. I called her 4 days later. Not 2 days, not 1-4. Because I'm 63 years old, and I no longer perform urgency. I don't feel. We dated for 14 months. It was, in many ways, wonderful. She was attentive when she was present, intellectually stimulating, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy my company in a way that felt uncalculated. My friend Russell met her twice, and both times pulled me aside afterward to express some version of concern. The first time he said, "She's impressive, Walter. Just make sure you know what you're getting into." The second time he was more direct. He said, "Walter, I like her, but I don't think she sees you the way Carol saw you. She sees what you are to her. That's different." I thanked him and told him he was probably overthinking it. He wasn't. We married on a Thursday afternoon in September, small ceremony, immediate family only, dinner at a restaurant we both loved. Gregory was my best man. He gave a toast that made me cry, which I had not expected. Diane's daughter from a previous marriage, Priscilla, was there. She was cordial. That was the best word for it. Cordial. The first months were good. We traveled. We had real conversations over long dinners. She worked long hours, but that was who she was, and I hadn't married her expecting that to change. I had my own work, my own schedule, my own life that ran parallel to hers in ways that felt, at the time, complementary. Then things began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you. The unraveling isn't usually dramatic. It's quiet. It's a series of small adjustments, small distances, small moments where you notice something that you can't quite name. She started taking calls during dinner. Not occasionally, consistently. She started referring to her business decisions in the singular again. "I'm thinking of expanding the client base. I've decided to bring on 2 new advisors." Not, "We're thinking, I'm thinking." I noticed, but I didn't say anything. That's also who I am. I observe. I give things time. Then I came home one evening in February to find Diane at the kitchen table with a folder open in front of her. and an expression on her face that I recognized immediately as the one she wore when she had already made a decision and was managing the rollout. She asked me to sit down. She told me she had been thinking seriously about financial security, about protecting what she'd built. She said that she hoped I understood, and that it wasn't about trust exactly, it was about prudence. She used the word prudence twice. Then she slid a document across the table and said, "I've had my attorneys prepare a postnuptial agreement. I'd like you to review it and sign it." I looked at the document. I looked at her. I said, "Smart thinking." Then I picked up the document, told her I wanted to have my own attorney review it, and went to my study. She seemed relieved. I think she had expected resistance, maybe even a scene, and when I responded with calm agreement, she took it as compliance. That was her first miscalculation. Her second miscalculation was in believing that she was the only prepared person at that table. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Arthur Finch. I've known Arthur for 31 years. He's 70 years old, semi-retired, and has a mind like a steel trap wrapped in a warm handshake. I described the postnuptial agreement and read him several of the key clauses. He listened without interrupting, which is his way. When I finished, he said, "Walter, she's protecting approximately 40 million in personal assets based on what you've described." I said, "I know." He said, "Does she know what you're protecting?" I said, "I don't believe she does." There was a pause. Then Arthur said, "Why don't you come into the office Friday morning? Bring your full asset summary. Let's put together something comprehensive." Now, here is where I need to explain something about myself, because without this context, the rest of the story won't make complete sense. When I told Diane I was in logistics, I was telling the truth. What I didn't elaborate on was that I had spent 38 years building a supply chain consulting group that had grown through a series of strategic decisions I'd made quietly and deliberately over decades into a network of 11 companies across 4 states. We consulted for mid-sized manufacturers, managed third-party logistics contracts, and over the past decade had expanded into warehouse infrastructure, actual real estate, not just operations. I had sold 2 of the companies at significant gains. I held equity positions in 3 others. The real estate portfolio alone, which I had assembled building by building over 20 years, had compounded into something I was honestly sometimes surprised by myself when I looked at the totals. Carol had known all of it. We'd built a large portion of it together. Actually, she had a business mind I respected deeply, and many of my best decisions came from conversations at the kitchen table with her late at night. After she passed, I continued building, partly because it was all I knew to do with the grief, and partly because it was the language she and I had shared, and I wasn't ready to stop speaking it. I had not hidden any of this from Diane. I simply had not explained it in detail. When she asked about my work, I described it in general terms. She never asked follow-up questions. And a man who has learned the hard way, and the long way that not every person who enters your life needs a full accounting of it, I didn't volunteer what wasn't asked for. Russell had known. Gregory had known. My accountant knew, obviously. But Diane? Diane had assessed me as a comfortable, modestly successful older man in logistics, and she had not seen any reason to look deeper. She managed hundreds of millions of dollars in client assets for a living, and she had not once, in 14 months of dating or 18 months of marriage, sat down and asked me to walk her through my finances. That oversight was about to matter enormously. Arthur and I spent 2 sessions building out the counter-postnuptial agreement. It was thorough. Arthur had a colleague with specific matrimonial law expertise review it as well. The document was, as Arthur described it with characteristic understatement, quite protective. I brought it home on a Tuesday evening, placed it on the kitchen counter, and told Diane that my attorney had reviewed her agreement and that I'd had one prepared in response, and that perhaps we should have our respective counsel review both together before anyone signed anything. She picked it up with the easy confidence of someone who assumed the contents would be straightforward. I watched her face as she read the first 2 pages. The easy confidence became something else, a kind of stillness that I recognized as the moment a very smart person realizes they may have made a significant error. She looked up at me and said, "Walter, what is this?" I said, "It's a postnuptial agreement. You wanted to be prudent. So did I." She went back to the document. She read more carefully this time. I poured myself a glass of water and stood in the kitchen and waited. She said quietly, "How much do you have, Walter?" I said, "Arthur can share the full summary with your attorneys. That's probably the appropriate channel." She called her attorneys that night. I know, because I heard her on the phone behind a closed door, her voice low and careful in the way it gets when she's managing something she hadn't planned for. Her lead attorney called Arthur the next morning. Arthur called me that afternoon and said, with the quiet amusement of a man who has been practicing law for over 4 decades and has seen almost everything, "Walter, they're requesting a sit-down. Apparently they were not aware of the scope of your holdings." I said, "I imagine not." He said, her attorney used the phrase significantly underestimated, and I believe that may be the most restrained way he could have put it. What followed was not a war. I want to be clear about that, because I am not a man who wanted a war. What followed was a series of careful, attorney-attended conversations in which both sides looked at the full picture and arrived at the same conclusion, that the postnuptial agreement Diane had presented had set in motion a process that, completed honestly, did not advantage her the way she had assumed it would. Her assets were real and substantial, but mine were, as Arthur put it to their attorneys without elaboration, of a different order. During one of those sessions, Diane looked at me across the conference table with an expression I had not seen from her before. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to the particular humiliation of realizing that the person you had quietly categorized, quietly assessed, quietly decided you understood, had been seeing you far more clearly than you had been seeing them. I didn't feel satisfaction in that moment. I want to be honest with you about that. I felt something more complicated, a kind of sadness, the way you feel when a thing you had hoped might be real turns out to be built on something too shallow to hold. Because that was the truth of it, wasn't it? She had married me with a certain picture in her head, a picture she had constructed without doing the work of actually looking. And in that picture, I was a supporting character in her story, comfortable, convenient, unlikely to complicate things. The postnuptial agreement wasn't a practical financial measure. It was a confirmation of how she saw me, and that was the thing I could not get past. Russell came over for coffee the Saturday after those sessions concluded. I told him the whole thing. He listened the way a man listens when he's heard enough of life to know that being right is sometimes the loneliest feeling there is. When I finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to be honest with her about what I know, and then I'm going to do what I should have done when you told me the first time." He said, "Which is?" I said, "Listen to you." He laughed. Then he got quiet and said, "Walter, you know what gets me? She managed other people's money for 20 years. She built a whole career on understanding what things are really worth. And she never once tried to understand what you were worth. That landed the way true things land, without drama, without decoration, just the weight of it settling in the room. I sat down with Diane that evening, alone, no attorneys. I told her that I had thought carefully about everything, and that I did not believe we had built a marriage. I believed we had built an arrangement, and that I had been the only one at the table who hadn't known that was what it was. She didn't argue. That was the most telling thing. She didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't say I was wrong. She sat very still in the way she sat when she was being honest with herself, and then she said, "I think I handled this very badly." I said, "I think we both made mistakes." Mine was not listening to the people who knew me well enough to see what I was walking into. We engaged our attorneys again, and we separated with the kind of careful, document-heavy civility that happens when two people are old enough and smart enough to know that tearing things apart costs everyone more than doing it with intention. I won't walk you through every detail of the financial resolution, because that's not the point of what I'm telling you. The point is this. She had come to that kitchen table believing she was the one who had something to protect, believing that her position, her company, her carefully constructed financial life needed shielding from the quiet older man in logistics she had married. She had never stopped to wonder whether the quiet older man in logistics might have been doing his own protecting all along, not from her, but for himself, for his family, for the life he had built across 4 decades of early mornings and deliberate decisions and the kind of slow, unglamorous work that doesn't generate headlines. She played a move she thought was sophisticated, and in playing it, she asked me to show my hand for the first time in our marriage. I showed it. Gregory called me a few weeks after everything was settled. He asked me how I was really doing, not the version people give when they want to signal they're fine. I told him honestly, better than expected, and a little tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with sleep. He said, "Dad, can I tell you something?" I said yes. He said, "Carol would have asked you about every single one of those companies by the second date. She would have had questions you hadn't even thought of, and she would have been proud of every answer." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I know, son, I know." Russell and I had breakfast the following Sunday. We sat on the back porch with coffee and didn't talk for a long time, which is one of the things I value most about a friendship of 30 years. The right to be quiet in it. After a while, he said, "So what's next?" I said, "I'm thinking of consolidating two of the companies, and Gregory wants to come in on the real estate side. I think it's time." He said, "Carol always said Gregory had your instincts." I said, "She did. She said that a lot." I'm 63 years old. I've built things that outlasted grief, outlasted self-doubt, outlasted a marriage I'd hoped would be real. I didn't build them loudly. I didn't announce them. I didn't need anyone's recognition to know they were there. My father used to say that the measure of a man is not what he tells the room he's worth. It's what he's still standing on when everything else falls away. I've been standing on the same ground for 38 years. It never needed anyone else to notice it to be real. But I'll tell you this, and this is the part I want you to hear, friend, wherever you are listening from tonight. Do not let anyone's failure to see you make you doubt what's there. The people who matter, the Russells, the Gregorys, the Carols, they already know. They knew before you had anything to show. And the ones who only looked at you long enough to take a measure they could use? They'll find out. They always do.